sadness doesn't have a minimum requirement. And those small losses, the ones that don't come with casseroles or condolence cards, they can accumulate quietly and very heavily if we never give them the space.
You're listening to Speak Mother, a podcast about reclaiming your voice, your identity, and your truth inside modern motherhood. I'm your host, Shannon Warner. Let's get into it.
Hello, friends. Welcome back to the podcast. I'm so glad you're here. We're continuing our exploration of On Our Best Behavior, The 7 Deadly Sins, and the Price Women Pay to Be Good by Elise Loehnen. As I've said throughout this series, you absolutely don't need to have read the book to be part of this conversation. We're just using it as a jumping off point to look honestly at our own conditioning, at the ways that we've been taught to stay small, suppress, and perform. Today, we're talking about sadness. Now, you might be wondering what sadness is doing in a book framed around the 7 deadly sins, and sadness is not on that list. So why does it get its own chapter? It's because Elise is making a larger argument here, that the same cultural machinery that turned natural human impulses into moral failures has also done a number on sadness. Historically, she explains there were actually 8 thoughts, not 7 sins, and sadness was one of them. It was later excommunicated. It was replaced by our friend sloth, and Elise argues that this erasure in itself is significant. A culture that couldn't tolerate sadness as a concept has spent centuries teaching us not to tolerate it in ourselves either. We live in a culture that tells us consistent happiness is not only possible, but expected. Think positively, be grateful, choose joy. And when that sadness shows up anyway, because we know it always does, sometimes it can be felt as failure, like we're doing something wrong. Sadness isn't a character defect. Sadness is the price of love. It's what happens when something matters to you and you lose it. Grief is unavoidable. And I want to be clear about what we mean by loss, because I think we've been taught to kind of rank our grief. Even if we're feeling a sadness, we're like, no, I know other people have it worse. We use this to decide whether something is significant enough to warrant real sadness. We do it to ourselves and we do it to other people. A death gets a funeral. A divorce might get some acknowledgement. But what about everything else? What about the job that you liked and lost? Or even the job you didn't like and still lost? What about the friendship that quietly dissolved? What about the person you were before you became a mother? Or the baby that you miscarried before anyone knew you were even pregnant? The city you had to leave? The version of your life you planned for that no longer feels possible? Or the relationship that you have but hoped would be different than it is? All of that counts. We have to remember that sadness doesn't have a minimum requirement. And those small losses, the ones that don't come with casseroles or condolence cards, they can accumulate quietly and very heavily if we never give them the space. Elise also talks about something called ambiguous loss. That's the grief that doesn't have a clear name or a ritual attached to it, like infertility, estrangement, the slow loss of someone to Alzheimer's or dementia, the end of a dream, whatever that dream is. These are all real losses too, and our culture barely acknowledges them. And that's because we have almost no cultural tolerance for grief in any form. Let's think about what we do when someone is grieving. We show up for the funeral, or we send the casserole. We check in for a little while, and then life moves on, and we assume that they can, should, and will too. There's this underlying message that we're all living by, that grief should have some sort of expiration date. That at some point, moving on is just the polite thing to do. It's expected, really. And I know this intimately. When my dad died 40 years ago, I had just moved to a new town 6 months prior. Our community, all of our people, they were somewhere else. And then 2.5 weeks after he passed, I had my second baby. I was postpartum in a new place and in the deepest grief of my life. People didn't know what to do. And I understand that now. Grief makes people uncomfortable, and discomfort makes people disappear. 2 of my dad's close friends stand out to me still for the way that they kept reaching out, checking in. But mostly, people stopped calling unless they needed something. And the world moved on while I was still in the thick of it. My job acted like nothing happened. They donated to a cancer charity in his name, something he would have absolutely hated. And from my memory, not one person that I worked with said a word to me about it. I think they kind of buried it because it backed up against my maternity leave. It was too complicated and it was too much. And hell, after 12 weeks, we should be over all this, right? We'll just pretend it didn't happen. Elise writes, the underlying message is that it's best to prioritize the comfort of those who would rather not bear witness to your pain. And I've thought about that a lot. And I've also been on the other side of it. My best friend lost her baby girl at 7 months old. She never made it home from the NICU. I was pregnant with my first, states away, and I never went. I blame the logistics and my money and my job, none of which were untrue. That was my life. Those were my circumstances. But I also know that I was hesitant because I didn't know how to show up for that kind of grief. The anticipatory grief when her daughter was declining rapidly, and then the grief afterwards. I waited until she came home, and I've carried that with me since. And I've taken the time to do the repair work in that friendship. I'm not sharing that to punish myself or virtue signal or anything like that. I'm sharing it because I think a lot of us have been on both sides of this. We've been the one whose grief has felt invisible, and we've been the one who kind of quietly retreated because we didn't know how to stay, what to say, what to do. And we weren't taught how to sit with grief. We weren't taught how to sit with our own, and we certainly weren't taught how to sit with someone else's. And Elise argues that this is particularly hard for men, and I'll get to why we're talking about the menfolk here in just a minute. Sadness has been coded as feminine, as weakness, and boys are pressed out of their emotional softness early. Research shows that by age 4 or 5, girls are still permitted to be emotionally expressive, while boys are being subtly, and sometimes not so subtly, pushed out of that space. We firm them up. We prepare them for a world that doesn't have room for their feelings. And then those feelings don't just disappear, they actually get outsourced. Harriet Lerner writes about how in any close relationship, partnerships, parent and child, even colleagues, someone tends to overfunction emotionally while the other party underfunctions. So it's a balancing act that the system finds on its own. We're doing this without realizing that we're doing it. And in most heterosexual partnerships, women end up carrying not only the weight of processing their own emotions, but the weight of processing their partner's emotions too. Someone has to do that work. And women have been socialized to be that person. We metabolize the feelings for people around us so they don't have to explore their own. And it's exhausting. And it's also quite costly because when we're perpetually holding everyone else's emotions, we don't have the space or bandwidth then to process and metabolize our own. Grief doesn't wait. It will find a way out sooner or later, one way or another. And if you've gone through a grief journey of any kind, we know that we don't just move on from grief, we move forward with it. We have to build the next version of our lives after the loss on the foundation of what we lost. And I think we need to hold more space for ourselves to acknowledge that, move through that, build from that. That's not weakness. That's actually what resilience looks like. Holding that loss and building towards the future. Elise writes, sadness, when it's survived and endured, is proof of our flexibility, of our capacity to love and to lose and to keep going. Submission and surrender are required, not performance of recovery, not moving on anyone else's timeline, actual surrender to what is. So what would it look like to let sadness be what it is? Maybe it's giving yourself more time than you think you need. Maybe it's telling someone the truth about how you're actually doing, not the version that makes them feel comfortable. Maybe it's being the friend who keeps calling 2 months later, 6 months later, 12 months later, when everyone else assumed you're fine. Maybe it's giving yourself permission to grieve the things that don't come with a ritual like a funeral. The relationship that ended without a clear moment of ending. The career path that you quietly, or not so quietly, walked away from. The friendship that faded when your life changed. And maybe it's recognizing that your capacity to feel grief is also proportional to your capacity to love. You can't have one without the other. Sadness is not a sign that something went wrong. It's a sign that something mattered deeply. So before we close, I have a few questions for us to sit with this week. As always, not homework, just invitations. What are you grieving right now, including the things that don't feel significant enough to count? Where have you rushed yourself through sadness to make someone else more comfortable? And is there someone in your life whose grief you've quietly disappeared from, not out of cruelty, but out of not knowing how to stay, what to say, or what to do? Just sit with those and let that be enough. We've now made our way through all of the 7 sins, and that feels pretty significant. So I'm curious what has stayed with you from the series, and where do you want to go from here? What topics are you craving? What questions are you sitting with that you'd love to bring into a conversation? There's a couple ways to get in touch with me in the show notes. I would love to hear from you. Let me know. I read every message, and I genuinely want to know what's on your hearts and minds. And if you're building something with your voice, or you've been circling the idea, I offer podcast strategy sessions. We spend 60 minutes together digging into your vision and your voice, and you leave with clear next steps. The link is in the show notes. Thanks for being here for this one. It was an important one for me. I love you, and I will see you back here next week.
Thanks for listening to Speak Mother. If this resonated, share it with a friend, and don't forget to follow the show so you never miss an episode. Keep speaking your truth. I'll meet you back here soon.